try. There we go. Okay, good. Well, it's good to see you all today. I'm grateful for this opportunity to be able to speak to you about why I'm a creationist. I thought I'd just say a word or two of introduction about myself to tell you why I'm interested in this subject. I've been interested in geology and collecting fossils and dinosaurs and all of those sorts of things ever since I was a young boy. And I think I always knew when I was very young that I wanted to become a geologist. And my first degree was in geology and biology. And then I did postgraduate studies in London, studying paleobiology, so that's fossils and the history of life. And particularly, specifically for my postgraduate studies, I studied dinosaurs. So that was something that I'd always wanted to do, I guess, as a boy. And I was able to actually study dinosaurs then at university. And that's just to say that this is a subject that's obviously very important to me, and I've had to think very carefully and deeply about it over the years. This question of origins, where do we come from? And so I want to explain to you why I'm a creationist. I want to begin with evolution. So, according to the modern theory of evolution, all living things that have ever lived, all of the diversity of life that we see around us, has descended from an original, single, universal common ancestor that lived sometime in the past, perhaps 4 billion years ago. And by solely natural processes of mutation and natural selection over a timescale of hundreds of millions of years, all of this diversity has come into existence. Now, nobody denies that living things change over time. We can all see that. We can all observe changes in living organisms through time. When I refer to the theory of evolution, I'm really talking about this big story of universal common ancestry, the idea that everything goes back to this single ancestor. And I think we have to acknowledge that evolution is a very compelling idea. It's very persuasive to many intelligent and thoughtful people. And I think we make a mistake if we dismiss evolution lightly. If we think that it's a silly idea. It is an idea that's very persuasive to many people. And one of the reasons that people find it so persuasive is that it seems to be supported by lots of evidence. And that evidence, which you can find in any standard biology textbook, comes from many disciplines of science. So we can study the fossil record, and we're told that we can find evidence of intermediate forms that bridge the gap between major groups. We can study what we call homology, the shared similarities that living things have in common with one another. We can look at mutations and selection that give us a mechanism for evolutionary change. We can look at biogeography, the distribution of plants and animals on the surface of the earth, and so on. And the power of evolution as an idea is that evidence from all of these many different fields of science seems to converge on this one explanation of universal common ancestry. And so I think we can understand why evolution is such a persuasive idea to many people. Now, of course, having said all of that, you may wonder then, why am I a creationist? If evolution is so persuasive and compelling, why do I reject evolution and why do I accept creation? And that's what I want to talk about today. Why am I a creationist? And I want to give you 4 reasons why I'm a creationist. The first one is that simple, compelling scientific theories, like the theory of evolution, often turn out to be wrong. And I want to give you some examples. Thank you. The second thing I want to talk about is we then need to turn to look at the evidence. And I want to look at 3 examples of what appear to be compelling arguments for evolution. And I want to argue that all of these arguments have significant problems that we need to think very carefully about. And then thirdly, I want to argue that belief in biblical creationism actually helps us to do good science, robust science, and to come up perhaps even with explanations which are better, that explain the data better than the standard evolutionary explanations. And then fourthly, as a Christian, I want to argue that creationism is good theology, that it's consistent with what the Bible teaches. So these are the four headings that I want to speak to very briefly. Firstly, simple, compelling theories like evolution often turn out to be wrong. One example is geocentrism. Now, this is the idea that the Earth is fixed and stationary at the centre of our solar system, and that the Sun and all of the other planets revolve around the Earth. And this is perhaps the most successful scientific theory of all time. It was almost universally believed by intelligent thinking people for maybe 1,500 years. And the reason was that the evidence seemed to support it. You only have to look up into the night sky and you can see that the other heavenly objects revolve around the Earth. And when scientists like Copernicus and Galileo came along and began to challenge this idea, actually the evidence at that point didn't really support them. And that's why it took a long time for geocentrism to be replaced by heliocentric ideas, the idea that the Sun is at the centre of our solar system. Actually, even heliocentrism is not really strictly correct, because even the Sun is not a fixed point. But here was a theory that held sway for a very long period of time, was very difficult to displace because it had a lot of evidential support, but it turned out to be incorrect. Let me give you one other example. This is it seems a very strange idea to us. It's the idea called preformism, and it concerns the development of the human embryo. And the idea of preformism was that the human embryo was a kind of miniature adult that simply unfolded during development. So in this idea, it was almost like an umbrella, as you open up an umbrella and it unfolds. The idea was that the embryo was a mini adult that was front-loaded into maybe the sperm, maybe the egg. There were debates about whether this miniature adult resided in the male sperm or in the female egg. And it just unfolded. And people who believed that the embryo was somehow assembled within the body of the mother were in a small minority because they couldn't explain how it happened. It seemed a very mystical idea that there was some sort of organising force that could just sort of develop an embryo within the body of the mother. But of course it turns out that those who believed that the embryo was assembled within the mother were correct, and the preformists were wrong. But it was a very successful scientific idea and seemed to be supported. So could evolution be like one of these other theories? You see, one of the things we can learn from the history of science is that the history of science is a story of theories that appeared very compelling at the time with lots of evidential support that were discarded. And there are numerous examples. And perhaps it depends on how we look at the evidence. I'm sure you've all seen illustrations like this one, an optical illusion, where perhaps some of you look at this picture and you see a young woman with her face turned away from the viewer. Or perhaps you look at this image and you see an old woman with a big long nose and a long chin. And perhaps it depends how we look at the evidence. We're all looking at the same evidence, the same picture, but we see different things as we look at the evidence. And so we need to look at the evidence carefully. So let's turn to some of the evolutionary evidence. And I want to look at 3 examples of standard textbook evidences for evolution. And I want to argue that they all have significant problems. The first one is homology, shared similarities. So think, for example, about your arm, your forelimb. You have one bone in the upper arm, you have two bones in the lower arm, and then you have a cluster of bones that make up the wrist and the hand, and then there are the bones that make up the 5 digits, the 5 fingers. This is called the pentadactyl or 5-digit plan. And this pattern of bones is shared by a wide range of other organisms among the vertebrates. But it's modified in different ways. So in the bat, we see the same pattern of bones, but it's modified into a wing for flying. In the whale, we have exactly the same pattern of bones, but it's modified into a flipper for swimming and so on. And Charles Darwin in 1859 came along. This pattern was well known at the time, and he provided an explanation. He said, well, the reason that these creatures share this common pattern is because they inherited it from a common ancestor. And through change over time, descent with modification, this pattern has become adapted for different functions and purposes. And that seems a very compelling explanation, very persuasive. And in fact, we can go further, because this pattern of similarities that we see is used by evolutionary biologists to construct evolutionary trees that show how different creatures are related to one another by the pattern of shared similarities. So here we have a simple evolutionary tree for this group of creatures, and you can see that among these creatures the wolf is unique because the wolf alone possesses hair. So only the wolf here has hair. But we can make a more inclusive group with the turtle and the wolf, because both of these creatures are what we call amniotes. Okay, they have the amniotic arrangement of the egg. And then we can make a more inclusive group still, including the salamander with the turtle and the wolf, because all of these creatures have 4 legs. They're tetrapods. And then we can add this fish, the trout, and join it with the salamander, the turtle and the wolf, because all of these creatures possess jaws. And then we can even add in the jawless fish here, the lamprey, because all of these creatures, lamprey and the other fish and the salamander, the turtle and the wolf, have a backbone. They're all vertebrates and so on. And so you can see that what we can do using these shared similarities is draw up a series of groups nested within bigger groups. You know, like those Russian dolls that stack one inside one another. Here we have groups within groups within groups. We call this a nested hierarchy. And evolutionists look at this and they say, well, here is compelling evidence for evolution, because this pattern of similarities matches the order of branching. You know, we can explain it by the fact that these different groups diverge from one another in a particular order. And all of the ancestors of this creature that first developed a backbone then inherited that characteristic from that ancestor. So this, I think, you know, if you're thoughtful about this seems a very compelling argument for evolution. But it's not without its problems. And I want to tell you about one of the problems today, briefly. And in order to explain one of the problems, I want to give you a specific example. Here we have 3 organisms. We have megabats. Megabats are fruit bats, like the ones in South America. And then we have the microbats, which are the more familiar bats that we see flying around here. And then we have primates. And an evolutionary biologist wants to know, how are these 3 groups related to one another? What was the order of branching? And so they look at shared similarities. And most evolutionary biologists think that this represents the evolutionary relationships of these 3 groups. They think that the megabats and the microbats are more closely related to one another than either is to the primates, because they have a very obvious shared similarity. The bat-like wing, it's very distinctive, it's very complex, and they share that characteristic in common. And so the idea is that at some point in the past an ancestor developed the bat-like wing, and then the megabats and the microbats have diverged since that ancestor acquired the bat-like wing. However, there are other similarities that we need to pay attention to. When we look at the primates, we find that the primates have a very complex and highly distinctive network of nerves that run from the eye to the midbrain. And interestingly, the primates share that very complex network of nerves with the megabats. The microbats don't have it, but the primates share that similarity with the megabats. And so if this evolutionary tree is correct, that must mean that that highly complex network of nerves must have evolved twice, independently. It must have evolved once in the primates, and then it must have evolved independently in the megabats because they didn't inherit it from a common ancestor. Now, some evolutionary biologists have looked at that and they've said, that doesn't make sense. This pattern of nerves is so complex and so distinctive, it's very, very improbable that it could have evolved independently twice. And so they argue that actually this is incorrect. They argue that this similarity means that the megabats and the primates are more closely related to one another. And so they've argued that in fact megabats are a kind of flying primate. Now, if this evolutionary tree is correct, we've solved the problem of the nerve network, because now it evolves in a common ancestor, and then the primates and the megabats split and they inherit that neural pathway. But now can you see you've got another problem? Because if this evolutionary tree is correct, we now have the problem that the bat-like wing has to evolve independently twice. It has to evolve once in the microbats, and then independently in the megabats. And of course a lot of evolutionary biologists think that's equally, or perhaps even more improbable. So the point here is that whichever of these evolutionary trees you choose, there are always similarities that do not fit the evolutionary tree. And this is the case every time that you draw an evolutionary tree. There are always similarities that don't match the tree. That sort of raises in my mind a serious question. Are these similarities really distributed in a tree-like pattern at all? Or are we imposing a tree-like pattern on the data, which really isn't there? So we need to think carefully about these arguments. Here's another argument that you'll find for evolution, and it concerns the order of the fossil record. For a long time, 150 years or more, we've known that in the fossil record, these groups of vertebrates appear in a particular order. So here we have a geological column. The oldest rocks are here, the youngest rocks at the top, and these vertical lines represent the distribution of these groups in the fossil record. And you can see that the jawless fishes appear first, followed a bit later by the fishes with jaws, and then we have the amphibians, and then the reptiles, then the mammals, and the birds. And this has been regarded as very compelling evidence for evolution, because if you draw an evolutionary tree for these groups, the order of branching in the evolutionary tree matches the order in which the groups appear in the fossil record. So that looks like two independent pieces of evidence that are confirming one another. And so this, again, has been used as a very powerful piece of evidence for evolution. But again, there's a problem. And I want to tell you about one of the problems with this argument today. And what I want to tell you about is a piece of work that was done by this scientist. This is Dr. Kurt Wise. He's a paleontologist. In fact, he studied for his PhD at Harvard under a very well-known evolutionary biologist, Professor Stephen Jay Gould, who some of you may have heard of. And some years ago, Kurt Wise did a very interesting study. He said, what happens if we look at the order of branching and the order of appearances in the fossil record, not with one group, the vertebrates. But what happens if we look at lots and lots of groups? So he constructed evolutionary trees, branching diagrams for many organisms. In fact, he came up with 144 series of branching orders based on evolutionary trees. He was then able statistically to compare the order of branching in those 144 evolutionary trees with the order in which those groups actually appeared in the fossil record. And he wanted to see how close the match actually was. So what did he find? Well, he found that in only 5 out of 144 examples that he studied, was there any statistically significant correlation between the order predicted from evolutionary trees and the actual order of appearances in the fossil record. In 95% of cases, the order of appearance in the fossil record was essentially random with respect to the evolutionary trees. So what he was comparing are these two pieces of data. Here we have an evolutionary tree for these groups of organisms, and you can predict from this tree that they ought to appear in the order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But when you actually go to the fossil record and you look at the order of appearance, you find that they appear 3, 1, 2, 5, 4, or something like that. And in 95% of cases, there was no statistically significant correlation between the two sets of data. So again, it raises a question. Are we right to regard the order of the fossil record as confirmation of evolution, when in most cases it doesn't really seem to support it? Let's think about a third argument, which concerns intermediate forms in the fossil record. So these are forms which are said to have arisen as one group evolves and gives rise to another group. And one of the classic evolutionary transitional forms, of course, is Archaeopteryx. You've probably heard of Archaeopteryx. It's a fossil that was found in Germany, in Solnhofen, and it has a strange combination of character traits. So in some respects, Archaeopteryx is bird-like. It has feathers. In fact, the feathers are asymmetrical, like the feathers of a modern flying bird. But in most other respects, Archaeopteryx is actually quite dinosaur-like. It has, for example, teeth in its bill. There are no modern birds that have teeth. It has wing claws, and it has a long bony tail. These are not features that we associate with modern birds. So it has this weird combination of bird-like and dinosaur-like characters. And evolutionary biologists say this is exactly what we'd expect, because we think that birds evolved from a dinosaur, a theropod dinosaur, at some point in the past, and so here is a creature that shares traits from both of those groups. Or take a creature like Acanthostega, which was discovered in Devonian sediments in East Greenland. Now, Acanthostega, again, is a very strange animal. It has a weird combination of characters. In some ways, it's tetrapod-like. It doesn't have fins like a fish. It has arms and legs with hands and feet that have digits. It has weird numbers of digits. It has 8 digits, not 5. But nevertheless, it's a tetrapod with limbs, not with fins. And yet in other respects, it's very fish-like. It has external gills like a fish. It has fin rays on the tail like a fish. It has a lateral line, which is a sense organ found in fishes. And so again, evolutionists look at this and they say, well, this is what we'd expect, because we think that the first tetrapods evolved from some fish-like ancestor, and here's a creature that seems to combine traits of both of those groups. But again, there's a problem with this argument, a number of problems, but here's one of the problems. We said that these creatures are strange mosaics. Actually, when we look at not only the fossil record, but also among living organisms, we find that mosaic forms that combine traits that you typically associate with 2 or more other groups are actually quite common. There are many of them. Take, for example, the red panda. biologists have long debated exactly how we should classify the red panda, because it's a bit of a puzzle. In some ways it has traits which would place it with the raccoons. Other traits would seem to place it with the bears, and so biologists argue about how we should classify it. Or take the hoatzin, which is a bird that lives in South America. The hoatzin is a very strange bird because it combines traits from several other bird groups in one organism. And here's the problem. These mosaic forms are very common, but most of them cannot be interpreted as evolutionary intermediates, for the simple reason that they connect the wrong groups. They don't connect groups which are thought to be ancestral and descendant groups in evolutionary terms. They have the wrong combination of characters. And so these are not interpreted as evolutionary intermediates. So again, it raises a question in my mind. Are we sort of picking examples that match our preconceived ideas and perhaps overlooking other evidence that doesn't so readily fit with our ideas? So all of these arguments, I think, we could go through others, have serious problems. But let me come on to the third point I want to make, which is, I believe that biblical creationism based on insights from the Bible, helps us to do good science, and it helps us to come up with explanations that actually deal with the data better. And I want to give you one example from my own research experience. This is a project that I worked on in North America with, it was led by Dr. John Whitmore, who's a geologist at Cedarville University in Ohio, and we worked with other colleagues in North America. And it concerns this sandstone layer in Grand Canyon. This is the Coconino Sandstone. It's a very prominent, forms cliffs, high cliffs, about 300 feet high in the Grand Canyon, about 100 meters high. And it extends the whole length of Grand Canyon. You can see it over here in the north rim of the canyon. It's this white rock layer that you see here. And for a number of years, myself and other colleagues have been working, studying this sandstone in the field and in the laboratory. We've also not only studied the Coconino, but equivalents of the Coconino found across the southwestern part of the USA and even here in Europe. When you look at the Coconino Sandstone up a bit closer, so when you go and stand in front of a rock outcrop, it has this appearance. You notice within the Coconino that there are these sloping layers, these inclined layers. These are called crossbeds. And the way that these crossbeds are thought to have formed is by the migration of sand dunes. So the idea is that the Coconino Sandstone was formed in an ancient desert back in the Permian period, and this wind-blown sand was forming these massive sand dunes. And what happens in a wind-blown sand dune is that the sand is transported up the back of the dune, and it gets to the crest of the dune, and then it avalanches down the front face of the dune, and it forms layers at the front face of the dune. And as the dune migrates, as it moves, it builds up a series of these inclined, sloping crossbeds. And that's what we see in the Coconino. So it's interpreted as an ancient wind-blown sandstone that was formed by the slow accumulation and migration of these wind-blown dunes. Now, why were we as creationists wanting to study particularly the Coconino Sandstone? Well, here's the problem for us as creationists. Here we have the stack of rock layers that we find in northern Arizona. For creationists, we believe that most of these rock layers were not formed over a long period of time, over hundreds of millions of years. We believe these rocks were formed as sediments that accumulated quickly during the global flood that happened in the days of Noah. We believe that these were formed during a global catastrophe when the continents were inundated with water. So we think these are probably flood rocks. And where's the Coconino Sandstone, this ancient desert deposit? It's right here in the middle of our flood layers. Now, you don't need to be a geologist to work out, here's a problem. If these rocks were formed during a global flood, how can we have a very thick, extensive desert deposit right in the middle of Noah's flood? So it doesn't make sense. And geologists over the years have studied the Coconino Sandstone and put forward a number of arguments for the desert origin of the Coconino Sandstone. Now, we don't have time to look at all of these today, but I want to focus in on a couple of the arguments. We examined all of these arguments in our research, but I want to focus in on just two. Think about the mud cracks at the base of the Coconino Formation, and then the vertebrate footprints, the fossil trackways that we find in the Coconino. So, when you go to Grand Canyon and you look at the base of the Coconino Sandstone, below the Coconino there's another rock formation called the Hermit Formation. And when you look closely at the boundary between the Coconino above and the Hermit below, you find that there are cracks that extend down into the Hermit Formation, which are filled with Coconino sand. And the argument has been that this is evidence of a dry, arid desert environment. The idea is that the Hermit Formation was a mud plain, and you know what happens to mud when it's baked under hot sun? It cracks, it shrinks and it forms big cracks as it desiccates. And the idea is that this was a mud plain that had baked hard in the hot sun and had cracked open, and then as these wind-blown dunes were coming across the landscape, the sand fell into these cracks and filled them with sand. So that was one of the arguments for a desert origin. A second argument were the vertebrate footprints. When you look at the crossbeds, these sloping layers in the Coconino, they're very often covered with little footprints of animals that appear to be moving around on the dunes. And a scientist called Edwin McKee, who studied the Coconino Sandstone back in the 1930s, said these look just like the kinds of tracks that animals leave on dry desert sand dunes. And both of these were key pieces of evidence for this desert origin of the sand. So we looked at all of these pieces of evidence. Let's focus in on those two particularly. Let's begin with the vertebrate tracks. Here you can see some of the fossil footprints in the Coconino. And they're very well preserved in many cases. You can see not only the little footprints, but even the toes. You can count the toe marks left by the animal in the sand. Well, one of my colleagues is Dr. Leonard Brand, who was mentioned earlier. He's one of the authors of that textbook that was recommended earlier. And Leonard has been studying these vertebrate footprints for many years. And in one of his studies some years ago, he surveyed 82 fossil trackways in the Coconino Sandstone along a place called Hermit Trail in the Grand Canyon. And he took careful measurements of the various trackways. And then what he did was he did some experiments in the laboratory. He had big tanks in which he built sand dunes, and he got animals, lizards and amphibians, that could walk over the sand dunes and leave tracks. And he had them make tracks under a variety of different conditions. So he had them make tracks on sand that was completely dry. He had them make tracks on sand that was just damp. He had them make tracks on sand that was completely saturated with water. And then he had them make tracks on sand that was completely submerged below water. And he observed those experimental trackways. And then he did a comparison of the fossil trackways with the experimental trackways. What did he find? Well, he found that the Coconino Sandstone trackways, the fossil trackways, did not look like experimental trackways that were made on dry sand. They didn't look the same. Nor did they look like the tracks made on damp sand or even on wet sand. The best match to the fossil tracks were tracks that were made by animals completely submerged underwater. And so he argued that this evidence had been misinterpreted, that these fossil footprints were actually made underwater. And he pointed out some other unusual features of the trackways. He noticed that some of the trackways drifted sideways, that the toes pointed in one direction, but the animal's track was moving in a different direction. And he also noticed trackways that appeared to move across a surface and then suddenly disappear. And sometimes they would reappear, like this track moving here, and then it seems to continue up there, but there are no tracks in between. And he said, how can we explain this? Well, he argued that the best way to explain it is that these were animals that were floating in water. They were drifting with a current. They were trying to move in one direction and being swept by a current in a different direction, sometimes being lifted off the sediment surface and then dropped down again onto the sediment by the water. So this looks like evidence of underwater origin of the sandstone. What about those mud cracks filled with sand? Here we have the Coconino Sandstone. It's this pale layer, cream-coloured layer. Then underneath we have this more red hermit formation. And you can see here are these cracks that extend down into the hermit filled with Coconino sand from above. So we decided to study these cracks in more detail, and we examined them, took measurements of the cracks, measured how deep and how wide they were at many localities around Grand Canyon. We took samples so that we could study them in the laboratory. We took samples of the hermit formation. One of the things that you need if a sediment is going to crack under the baking of the sun is you need lots of clay or mud. It's mud that shrinks and cracks. We actually found that the hermit formation has very little clay or mud. It doesn't have enough clay or mud for shrinkage cracks to form. So we began to realise whatever these things are, they're not shrinkage cracks, they're not desiccation cracks. When we plotted the size of the cracks on a map, we found something very interesting. This is the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River, and these wedges represent the size of the cracks that we measured, the width and the depth of the cracks. We found that the biggest of the cracks in Grand Canyon were here along the Bright Angel Trail. And as you went east and west and north, away from the Bright Angel Trail, the cracks got smaller and eventually disappeared altogether. That's a very interesting distribution. Why are they biggest here at the Bright Angel Trail? Well, the Bright Angel Trail is the location of the biggest earthquake zone that cuts across the Grand Canyon. It's a fault line, the biggest fault line that cuts the Grand Canyon. And we began to realise these cracks are nothing to do with drying out under the sun. These cracks are earthquake cracks. They're tectonic cracks. So at some point, this earthquake, this movement along the fault, caused the hermit formation to crack open, and Coconino sand was forcibly injected in a liquidized state into those cracks long after the sediments were actually deposited. So that they're not evidence for a dry desert environment at all. We actually published this work in a mainstream geology journal called Sedimentary Geology. And as we went through each of these arguments for a desert origin, we found that every one of them turned out to be mythological. Not one of the arguments for a desert origin of the Coconino actually stacked up when we looked at it in detail. And we made a number of new discoveries that nobody had ever found before that supported an underwater origin for the Coconino. So we think that the Coconino was actually laid down as very large underwater sand dunes. Even today, where you have, in the shallow oceans, where you have a good supply of sand, and you have strong, powerful currents, very large sand dunes can build up. There are large sand dunes on the floor of the North Sea between Holland and between England. And in fact, it was a Dutch engineer who first did a sonar survey across the North Sea and mapped these huge sand dunes, maybe 15 metres high, across the floor of the North Sea. He said it was like flying over a desert, looking at the floor of the North Sea. So we think that these giant sand waves, like the ones you see here in Long Island Sound, New York, this is how the Coconino Sandstone was formed. And our sand wave model can explain all of the data that we were able to collect. So we can do good science as creationists. We can investigate problems and solve problems and produce science that is worthy of publication even in mainstream journals. The final thing I want to say very briefly is that creationism, I believe, is good theology. What is the central message of Christianity? Well, we can perhaps sum it up in this very famous Bible verse, John chapter 3 and verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So the central message of Christianity is that Jesus Christ came into the world to die so that we might live. But why did Christ have to die? Why did Jesus Christ have to die? Well, the Bible says it was to pay the penalty for sin. He himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree. But that raises another question, doesn't it? Why did Jesus have to physically die to pay the penalty for sin? Why wasn't there some other way to pay the penalty for sin? Why was physical death, why was bloodshed necessary to pay for sin? Well, the Bible tells us it's because the penalty for sin is death. The Bible tells us the wages of sin is death. And this is a message which is interwoven through the whole of the Bible. We're told that in the beginning, when God first made the world, there was no death. But death came into the world as an intruder into God's creation, if you like, when Adam sinned. So when people first sinned, that brought death, physical death, into the world as a punishment, as a judgment because of sin. So I'll just wait for the bell to finish. And the Bible tells us, the New Testament tells us, that death is an enemy. Okay? Death is not something God created in the beginning. Death is an enemy. And the Bible tells us that because of what Jesus did on the cross, and when he was raised from the dead, he's triumphed over death. So death is a conquered enemy. Death has been defeated. And when Jesus comes back, the Bible tells us that death is going to be abolished. Okay, death is going to be done away with. And there will be a time when there's a new heavens and a new earth, and the Bible says there shall be no more death. So the Bible gives us a coherent story of death. There was no death. Death came into the world through sin. Christ has defeated death, this enemy. One day death is going to be abolished. But now think about death in the evolutionary story. According to evolution, death is not the punishment for sin. Because according to evolution, death, physical death, has been around for hundreds of millions of years. Bloodshed has been around for hundreds of millions of years, long before there were people. Suffering and sickness and disease have been around for hundreds of millions of years. In fact, death is as old as life itself. It's perfectly natural. It's just the way the created order is. And in fact, death is an integral part of the evolutionary process. Darwin himself said, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the production of the higher animals directly follows. I would argue that these two views of death, the biblical view of death and the evolutionary view of death, are mutually exclusive. They're not compatible with one another, and so it's not possible, as far as I can see, to simply take evolution and import it into the Bible. They're telling us very different stories about death. So those are the reasons that I'm a creationist. I think at the bottom line, if you like, creationism provides better scientific explanations of evolution, and creationism is the only view of Earth history that I think is compatible with traditional Christian teaching about the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the end of my presentation. Now we have, I think, until 11 o'clock. So we have a bit of time for questions. We have about 10 minutes. So if any of you would like to sort of ask questions about what's been said, or maybe things I didn't talk about, then feel free. There's a time now you can put your hand up and ask a question. And there's a